Thank you all for joining us today. My name is Lane Norton, and I'm the Assistant Dean for Advancement in the Maxwell School. And I'm delighted to welcome you to this virtual alumni conversation in honor of International Women's Day and Women's History Month. Before we begin our conversation, we recognize with respect the Onondaga Nation, firekeepers of the Haudenosaunee, the indigenous peoples on whose ancestral lands Syracuse University now stands. We also acknowledge and support those struggling against institutional racism and structural violence and are working toward a better future today. Today's event continues virtual programming from the Maxwell School to engage our faculty, alumni, and friends on topics of the day. We are recording this event and will post the recording on the Maxwell School YouTube channel so that members of the Maxwell community who could not join us today can watch as well. We are pleased to provide closed captioning during our program. If you would like to view the closed captions, click the CC button in the toolbar. We thank our transcriptionist, Melissa, for her services today. Later in the program, we will have the opportunity to ask questions. To do so, please click the chat icon at the bottom of your screen to enable the chat window, and we will ask the question for you. It's now my pleasure to introduce the Dean of the Maxwell School, David M. Van Slyke. Dean Van Slyke is the Louis A. Bantle Chair in Business Government, a tenured full professor of the Maxwell School and the College of Arts and Sciences, and a two-time recipient of the Burkhead Award and Professorship for Teaching Excellence. He is a leading international expert on public-private partnerships, public sector contracting and contract management, public and nonprofit management, and policy implementation. Dean Van Slyke serves as director and fellow of the National Academy of Public Administration and is a member of the organization's expert advisory team for the Office of the Inspector General at the Department of Homeland Security. He is also engaged in the network of schools of public policy, affairs, and administration, the Association of Professional Schools of International Affairs, and the University Leadership Council on Diversity and Inclusion in International Education. Dean Van Slyke, it's my pleasure to hand the program over to you.
Thank you, Lane. I'm delighted to introduce this virtual program, a conversation with several of our exceptional alumni in recognition of International Women's Day, celebrated earlier this month. It's appropriate and very reflective of the wide reach and impact of Maxwell alumni that our panelists are participating virtually from 3 countries, 2 US states, and 4 time zones. Our participants include our panel moderator, Kristin Patel, who serves as the Donald P. and Margaret Curry Gregg Professor of Practice in Korean and East Asian Affairs at the Maxwell School. The Gregg Professorship was established in 2009 by a generous gift from Korean-American businessman Spencer Kim and is named in honor of former US Ambassador to South Korea, Donald Gregg, who served in that role from 1989 to 1993. Gregg was previously a member of the National Security Council staff and became Vice President George H.W. Bush's National Security Advisor. He also worked for the Central Intelligence Agency from 1951 to 1975. Before joining Maxwell, Chris served in HSBC's Asia Pacific Compliance Office in Hong Kong, where she built and managed the bank's regional financial crime intelligence capabilities. Additionally, Professor Patel's public sector career includes more than 2 decades in increasingly senior management positions in the US federal government, including as Deputy Director of Intelligence at the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network in the US Department of the Treasury, where she focused on high priority illicit finance challenges, including counterterrorism, fraud, and money laundering issues. Professor Patel serves as a faculty member in the Policy Studies program and teaches undergraduate courses in policy studies and graduate courses in public administration and international affairs. Our panelists include Nuria Espach Fernandez, who currently serves as Minister of Defense for Peru. Throughout her career, Nuria has worked in the public and private sectors in leadership roles, including Chief Executive, Vice Minister, and General Secretary in numerous Peruvian ministries, including as the Chief Executive of Peru's National Civil Service Authority. Minister Espach has also worked in higher education as a professor at the Pontifical Catholic University of Peru and the Institute of Governance and Public Management of the San Martin de Perez University, and in the private sector at organizations including the Rio Tinto Mining Company, Grana Montero Group, and Hasa Consultores. Appointed Minister of Defense in November 2020, she is the first woman to hold this position in the country's history. Our panel participants also include Shiro Nanasavam, who currently serves as the Chief Executive Officer of Social Impact, a global management consulting firm that advances development effectiveness through monitoring, evaluation, strategic planning, and capacity building services. Shiro brings over 25 years of international development experience in program, operational, and leadership roles to her role as CEO of Social Impact. Shiro's talent for developing strategy and translating it into action has allowed her to serve organizations ranging from for-profit consulting firms, government agencies, multilateral agencies, and nonprofit organizations. She is passionate about building high-performing, diverse, and inclusive teams, using data to drive decision-making and mentoring, and coaching the next generation of leaders in international development. And finally, our panel also includes Jackie Williams-Bridgers, a leader of public sector reforms and good governance initiatives. Jackie has over 25 years of experience in evaluation, audit, and investigation of development assistance, foreign policy, intelligence, and international security programs. And she has worked with government, civil society organizations, and parliamentarians to construct organizational, regulatory, and legislative reforms. Jackie also has extensive federal government experience, previously serving as the former Inspector General of the U.S. Department of State and as Managing Director of International Affairs and Trade for the U.S. Government Accountability Office. Jackie currently leads a 4-year U.S. Agency for International Development activity to support good governance reforms at the national and local levels of government in Serbia. Chris, Nuria, Shiro, and Jackie, thank you so much for joining us. We're really looking forward to your conversation. Chris, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Dean Bensleich. It is an honor to be a moderator of such a distinguished panel. So over the next 40 minutes or so, we're going to talk about women in leadership positions and as role models. So to start off, Nuria, could you describe your work leading the Ministry of Defense?
Thank you. Well, first of all, I want to say that I'm thrilled to be here to join this meeting and to see friends and former professor of mine here. And as you know, I am a proud Maxwellian, and I want you all to know it. About my job, last November, I was invited by President Sagasti to be part of the cabinet. Since then, I have the great honor to be the first woman to serve as Minister of Defense. And in my current position, I am responsible for leading my sector in duties such as guaranteeing the territory's sovereignty, independence, and integrity. We also participate in humanitarian operations and disaster risk management. And during the pandemic, our work has also been to contribute with the fight against COVID through activities such as securing the vaccination process and providing the most vulnerable citizens with testing, medicines, and food. We fulfill these responsibilities working with Peru's armed forces. I would like to point out that this is a transitional administration. As such, we only have a few months to achieve the specific goals we set when we took office. In this context, our primary mission is clear, is to support our armed forces to improve their capacity to fulfill their roles. This implies, among others, leaving a balanced and healthy budget for the next administration and making sure that the modernization of the military stays on track. We are also working to start the transition to the civil service regime, promote the staff access to health protection, increase transparency, and boost mechanisms to avoid corruption, and ensure that women and men have the same growing opportunities. I'm completely aware that holding a position previously reserved for men represents an extraordinary opportunity to show women that all their aspirations are perfectly valid and possible. I am deeply committed to make sure that more girls know that the military is a place that they can fulfill professionally while contributing to our country's defense and development. Actually, the point is that the military welcomes them. As former President and Minister of Defense of Chile, Mrs. Bachelet shared with me a few weeks ago that institutions and society have often excluded women from various spaces only because of tradition. For so many years, in areas such as the armed force, our access was denied by the mere fact that this has always been a duty for men. That's why since I took the office, I am committed to never taking a no for an answer when seeking to achieve greater inclusion of women. And in fact, my goal is to make sure that everyone competes on fair conditions, selecting the best people for the job, disregarding their gender.
Thank you so much. To Shiro, could you talk about your role as leading and CEO of Social Impact?
Sure. Thank you. And, thank you all for inviting me. It's just really a pleasure to be here today. So first of all, I guess I will start by saying that Social Impact is we're kind of a niche consulting firm in the international development sector. And our mission is to dramatically improve the effectiveness of development assistance. So we're not an implementer. We don't do health and agriculture and governance projects, but we work with usually funders of those projects at all stages of the project cycle, from planning and design to monitoring to evaluation of all kinds to research and analytics to learning, all these interventions that help to improve the effectiveness of the work that is being done. And so my role in the company, I have been at Social Impact for 8 years. I've been the CEO since this year. And my role is really to be kind of the captain of the ship, which is to say that I have a role that is both strategic as well as tactical. It's strategic because my job is to help to direct the company to be able to see, 5 steps down the road, to spot opportunities, to help us to pivot and position with those opportunities. It's also my job to help elevate and lift the reputation of the company, to increase its visibility, and to ensure its financial health so that it can kind of grow and prosper as it has. This is our 25th year. And so, it's for me very interesting to kind of come into this role. It's a privately held company. And so I'm the first CEO who is not an owner of the company. And it's a really neat time to be in the company, leading it, starting in this 25th year when we've built up this great reputation within our sector, and now we're looking to the future. So I guess the final thing I will say is that, we're a consulting company, and so we are only as good as an organization as the people that work in it. So a very big part of my role is to make sure that we are taking care of our people. On this panel, and as we're, thinking about International Women's Day, I'm really proud that in our headquarters operation, we're 70% female. In our leadership team, we are more than 50% female. These are really unusual statistics, particularly in our industry. So that's like a really important platform from which, I want to build.
Thank you so much, Shira. Over to Jackie now. Jackie, could you talk about your work leading the project for USAID in Serbia? For the audience, is Dean Van Slyke said, we have our panelists are from all over, and so over to Europe, or Eastern Europe, to Jackie.
Thanks, Chris. And I also want to thank Maxwell for being the host of this event. It's a formidable institution. And as we spoke a little bit before the start of this session, it has worldwide constituencies and graduates. So I'm glad to join you from Eastern Europe here. I'm working as an implementing partner for the US government here in Serbia. I work both at the national levels, the central levels of government, and with local government institutions to support them in implementing policy reforms and to change the way in which they conduct their businesses so as to have a greater impact on good governance in Serbia. Our project was designed by USAID and launched in 2018 to help improve transparency of government and engagement of citizens with their government, and to ensure that government was more responsive to the essential needs and service delivery to its citizens. So at the local government level, we partner now with 25 different local self-governments throughout the country, and we work to build customized assistance aligned with our project objectives and goals to create that transparency and accountability and engagement with citizens. We've created incubators for change, I will call them, looking for local self-governments that we can help to introduce interactive budget portals so that citizens can actually access and see and learn what their government is planning in terms of building infrastructure, creating markets, roads to market, creating more environmentally friendly service delivery in country. We also work with them to create single administrative points where we reduce the human touch on delivery of services. So a newborn mother only has to go to one stop, one desk to register the birth of her child, to register her other children for school, to identify whatever tax credit she might be able to achieve for her newborn child. And it also reduces the opportunity for those who want to engage in corrupt behavior to ask for funds or a little tax in order to get those kinds of services delivered to her. We're also working with young people in Serbia, and I must say that young girls in high schools are at the forefront of all of our efforts to create more democratic processes within the high schools. So we're now working with about 27 high school parliamentarian groups to educate them about local budgeting, to create voting processes within their high schools to identify school modernization projects, and then to vote on those, to select the projects, to offer to the local assembly, and the local assemblies we've worked with to get their guarantee that they will fund those projects. So over the past 2.5 years, $15 million has been dedicated to fund the 27 priority projects that these young people have identified for their schools. And much to our delight, these projects are like putting in air conditioners and building libraries in their schools. These are not frivolous projects. And so the young people here, which is very important because there has been an out-migration of the youth from Serbia for what they see as the lack of opportunity. And now it gives them something to hope for. Moving to the central level of government, we work with independent oversight institutions to help build their capacity to prevent and to detect and to investigate corruption in country. So we work with the State Audit Institution, the Anti-Corruption Agency, and as importantly here in Serbia, in 2018, the parliament codified 27 offenses as corruption for the first time in Serbia. They also created 4 anti-corruption courts and 4 aligned public prosecutors' offices to focus their attention on corruption and successful prosecution of those public officials engaged in corrupt behavior. So now we're working with the prosecutors to train them on the new public procurement law and how to detect bid rigging collusion. We're working with the courts to appreciate the use of forensic experts that prosecutors may bring alongside to investigate more complex crimes in country. And then, as importantly, we're creating an electronic register of corruption cases, something that Serbia is in dire need of as it aspires to join the European Union. A registry that will allow them to track and monitor the progress of prosecution of corruption cases, and as importantly, to identify when there are bottlenecks that are getting in the way of efficient movement of cases through the courts. It's been a joy. My prior 8 years were in Southeast Asia. So working here with a new democratic state has been a challenge, but filled with rewards. Chris.
Thank you. Shira, you mentioned that you talked about building a diverse and inclusive team at Social Impact. So I wanted to ask you about what International Women's Day means to you. And given that it's Choose to Challenge is the theme this year.
Yeah, so for me, Choose to Challenge it's a call to action, right? And for me personally, it's not just a call to action for gender diversity, which is very important, but it is a call to action for diversity, equity, and inclusion more broadly, whatever the sort of group we're talking about. And, in international development, I alluded to this earlier, this is a challenge in our sector, right? Since last summer, we have been talking more openly about this challenge and the some of the neo-colonial foundations or the colonial foundations of development practice. And so for me, Choose to Challenge is really about, moving towards greater diversity, greater equity, greater inclusion for all people, like in my role as the CEO, for our staff, for our consultants, and also in our sector. As a woman of color in the role that I'm in right now, and as an immigrant, this for me is not just like something that is part of my job. It's kind of it's a personal priority. And, I think that it's a personal priority to be both an advocate for change, but also an agent of change. And so, last summer, when, after the killing of George Floyd, and there was just this sort of, movement for racial equity, and many organizations were kind of looking inwardly at themselves and saying, okay, what can we do better? And we did the same thing. And we're a company we're an evidence company. So we looked at our data. That was the first thing we did. And one of the big gaps that I found was that there was no data. We had data for our company, but there was no data on diversity, equity, and inclusion in our sector. There is one GAO report that looks at USAID, but if you're an implementing partner, that is not a benchmark, right? And so I was just kind of astounded by this because fundamentally, I believe in the power of data to help to effect change. And so, I said, look, we need to change this. Like, this is not okay that we don't know what is going on in our sector. And so I called up some of my friends, and we went about developing a survey. And we launched it last week. It's called the Bridge Survey, Benchmarking Race, Inclusion, and Diversity in International, in Global Engagement. It's out to over 400 organizations in our sector. This was, as much a story about filling, a dire need in our sector as it was about like 4 women who came together and said, hey, we're going to change this, and we're in the process of doing that. And so, so this is, I'm really passionate about kind of shifting the needle on diversity, equity, and inclusion, not just in my organization, but in the sector as a whole. And I think we have an opportunity now. So going to do my part to make sure we don't let that go by.
Thank you. When you were talking about shifting the needle, it brought to mind Nuria's experience, because as the first Minister of Defense, Nuria, you're a real role model for girls and women in your country. And so I wanted to ask you if you could talk about a woman colleague or a role model who has supported and inspired you over the course of your career.
Yep. Thank you. Thank you for the question. Actually, I think that International Women's Day and month is an opportunity to recognize the generations of women before us that battled against the glass ceilings that often serve to prevent our capacities. Also to acknowledge that thanks to their struggle, we have opportunities that women previously did not have, such as the right to vote or to study whatever we wanted, or to join the military. My mom is one of these women, actually. She's part of a generation that started to free themselves from the biases that limited women's to professional development. Hers, I think, was a bridge generation between our grandmothers, allotted to the domestic duties, and ours, that has the chance to access places and activities previously reserved for men. One of my mother's strongest qualities is that she never takes a no for an answer. This characteristic and her work ethics allow her to achieve her professional and personal objectives. At the same time, she raised my 2 siblings and me, and was a full-time school teacher, studied, believe it or not, a dozen masters. She had 2 doctorates together of being a union leader. So she never let existing biases bring her down. My mom always encouraged me to fight for my aspirations and to accomplish them only thanks to my efforts and capabilities. She guided me, but never did my own homework. There were no shortcuts with her. I think that International Women's Day serves as a reminder about how far we have come, and is also an opportunity to reinforce our commitment to continue the efforts of those who came before us, and to guarantee that future generations have even fewer barriers to overcome. Also reminds us that even with the progress achieved, the field is not yet leveled. For instance, in my country, more than half of the women are underemployed, while only 3 out of 10 men are. Also, 38 Peruvian women between 15 and 49 report having suffered violence from their partner in the last 12 months, a figure that rises to 63% if we consider their entire life. So I would like to stress that International Women's Day and a month is an opportunity to celebrate what we have achieved so far and to rethink on the path that is still ahead of us. In short, this is a journey that women and men must travel together to develop as individuals and put our capabilities to the service of our country. And as Shiro said, not only an advocate for change, we need to be a key actor in this change.
Thank you so much. Your comments about women and girls in the situation with unemployment and opportunities, building opportunities for them, echoes what Jackie said about the young women in Serbia and how they're inspired. So to Jackie, I'm going to ask the same question. What is there a role model, or was there a role model or a colleague who inspired you over the course of your career?
Yes, actually, there were two. And I want to pick up a little bit of what Maria said in reaching back within our own families and how that familial influence can have such lasting impressions on us. I took 10 years of classical ballet as a child. I aspired to be a ballerina. And when I was about 14, it was my 10th year of ballet, my grandmother, who I admired so much, she had never worked outside the home, but she was the core of our family, you know, that matriarch, that strong matriarch. And she turned to me and she said, Jackie, you know, little Black girls can't be ballerinas. Oh, my ambitions, they were dashed and I was deflated. So some 2 years later, at age 16, I was narrowing my search for colleges, and my parents started planning a trip. Of course, one of those trips was to the Maxwell School or to Syracuse University. And my parents said, your grandmother is going to accompany you on this trip. And I said, oh, this is not going to be good. I don't see the light at the end of this tunnel. So after we visited 3 colleges, and we narrowed it down to Syracuse and my aspirations on Maxwell School, my grandmother turned to me and said, you know, you still can't be a ballerina, but here I see that you can be anything that you want to be. And so I learned from her 2 advisories to me, one early on, and she was right. I couldn't be a ballerina, but it wasn't because of the reason that she gave. It was because I learned that the average height of a ballerina was about 5 inches shorter than me. But she was right on the second advice, and I followed her words to this day, that I can do anything that I want to do. And I've used those moves as a ballerina to reach across the world in my career and spanning my opportunities to learn from countries and leaders around the world. But I also want to mention a second woman who was an inspiration, and this is a professional woman. In the 1990s, when the words anti-corruption were just coming to the forefront of people's speech and talk in the international development arena, I was attending an international anti-corruption conference in Durban, South Africa, 1999. There were over 1,000 delegates at this conference. And I was in a plenary session, over 1,000 people seated, and there was a panel of all men sitting in front of us, addressing us about the sources of corruption, identifying, detect corruption. And in the midst of these 1,000 delegates, a woman stood up, who I later learned was the Minister of Ethics and Integrity in Uganda. And she stood up and she said in a very bold voice, I must be in the wrong room, because all I see are men on this panel in front of this robust audience. She says, and in fact, this panel has no good insight into the sources of corruption, because the persons who we should be having speak to us are the women who are in the household, who see what comes through those doors, who often are the beneficiaries of that corrupt behavior. And I said, oh my gosh, this small voice of this single woman in this group of 1,000 illuminated the entire audience, and almost everyone stood up and gave her a standing ovation. It was such a moving point in my career. It just opened my eyes. You have a voice, you have to use that voice. We have a unique perspective as women that we have to bring to the table, because oftentimes, historically, in our paths, that voice of a woman has not been there. Chris.
Thank you. You know, the theme for both your comments and for Nuria comments has been about not taking no for an answer or defining the conversation for yourself. So to Nuria, you know, you said a couple times now, never take no for an answer. So that can be really challenging. Not everyone wants to hear no. So what challenges or barriers have you faced during the course of your career as you've had to say no, and how did you overcome those barriers?
Well, in 2006, I was appointed as vice minister by a prominent figure in Peruvian politics. At that time, I was the first woman, again, to hold this position in the Ministry of Defense. Just a few days after I took the office, the minister assigned me to chair a meeting with high-ranking officials from the military. And to be honest, the meeting was supposed to be led by the other vice minister, but he had to travel. So I arrived to the meeting, to pass a few instructions that the minister and I had previously discussed. And there I was received by 50 plus officers, and all men, of course. And I sat at the U-shaped table, heads, and started to communicate the announcements. And as I finished talking, the highest ranking officer rudely, very rudely, said, no way, there is no way we would implement that. This is not going to happen. And when I tried to reconvene him with the ranked officers to a small room to discuss the announcements, and he dismissed me and said that he only had to repeat his commanding officer, of course not me, and I wanted to cry, but I couldn't have allowed this to happen. Then minutes later, back in my office, I could not stop thinking about the defiance, the awkward and painful silence during the meeting. So I quickly prepared my resignation letter, and headed to the minister's office. And there, the minister asked me what happened. And after I told him, he was fuming. He convened the general commanders of the services within 15 minutes notice. And following a brief conference with them, he called me back to his office. And there, the general commander of the officer that defied me apologized in the name of the service. And it became clear to me that my boss had backed me, and he believed in my capabilities and had let the general commanders know that. And the next day, I was back in the same room with the same 50 plus officers. And only this time, there was no defiant response from any of them, including that officer. This is just an example of how it has been usual for women not to be judged for our capabilities. And I know that the frustration I experienced at that time is something that many of us have shared for a long time. And I think that overcoming these biases requires us to do our homework and to be prepared on our work issues, same or more than anyone that we are dealing with. And it also requires us to have a strong personality, not take no for an answer, and be confident enough with ourselves to transmit our knowledge. But women should not have to do this alone. We need men to be equally committed to ensuring that existing barriers cease to prevail, such as my boss was at that time. And I'm also sure that a solid academic background, such as the one I acquired at Maxwell, prepares us to confront uncertain situations we face during our professional life. That's why I thank so much Maxwell for not only for the world-class education that provide me with tools that were and still are essential in breaking the barriers I have faced.
That's great. I think your point about having support from male colleagues and male superior officers is really important, and really helps to kind of drive forward in being able to allow women to have a voice and to be able to express them at the workplace and elsewhere. Jackie, I'm going to ask the same question for you, because you discussed the importance of women having a voice. What challenges or barriers have you faced, and how did you overcome them?
Often, as I rose through my career, I was the only woman at the table. At GAO, I was selected into the senior executive service as perhaps one of the youngest. And certainly I was the first African-American woman to be selected from the ranks into the senior executive service there. And early in my career, I often felt I needed some clarification, perhaps, of a statement made by a colleague sitting at a table. Or I had a question that I wanted to ask, but I was reticent to ask. However, then I would hear one of my male colleagues ask the same question that I was going to ask, or make the very same comment that I was going to make. And I said, well, why didn't I ask that? Well, why didn't I offer my idea? And it was like I was robbed. I was robbed of my idea. And so I learned the hard way by feeling I could have contributed, and I denied myself that opportunity to contribute. And then speaking about having a male colleague, when I was at State, I had the great honor for the first of 3 secretaries that I served there as Inspector General was the late Warren Christopher. And he told me, as he would invite me to sit at the table of the weekly staff meetings, Jackie, it doesn't matter where you sit at the table, it's how you sit at the table. You have a voice, use it. You were invited here to be a part of this group of assistant secretaries because someone felt that you had something to offer. And that one of those someones was me. And so I carried that with me. I have a voice, I have to use it. Don't let my opportunity to contribute be denied by me. Chris.
Thank you. You know, it's interesting, in the conversation about the importance of speaking up, and as you said, speaking up in representation. And so to Shira, I wanted to ask a question about representation and how the recent mobilizations for equity and inclusion have helped women advance in positions of power globally, and how having women in positions of power and representing women in senior roles is how important that is. Welcome your thoughts.
Yeah, I think that, certainly on the global stage, right, looking at our own country, for instance, I think we have a woman vice president. We have a vice president who is the first woman of color. We have, on tap to be the most diverse cabinet in the history of our country. So I think, I think that this, massive movement of the last, 8-9 months in particular has really kind of contributed to that. I'm also struck that, like here we are kind of still in a global pandemic. And here was this movement that was happening during a pandemic. And just so struck by the really powerful examples of female leadership in countries like New Zealand and Germany, right? Where these were very high stakes situations, and how well some of these leaders performed. And I was reading the other day a really interesting analysis where they talked about how a lot of times women leaders find themselves in this like sort of double bind situation, right? If you're tough, if you're decisive, all of a sudden you're too aggressive. On the other hand, if you operate according to, the expectations for your gender, then you're like too weak and you're right. And the point they were making was that in these crisis situations, we found women shining because they could do both. They could be decisive and make decisions, as well as be compassionate and caring and all of that, right? And so that the moment really kind of called for both aspects, and that women were like so well positioned to deliver that. And Jackie was talking earlier about this sort of unique perspective that we have as women. And I think that's it. Like, that's the thing that has enabled women to really shine when they've had that opportunity. I think the one other thing that I will say about this recent mobilization is that I really do feel, I think for the first time in my career, and the first time that, since I've been in this country, that there is kind of a fundamental shift that is underway. And so when I look at that fundamental shift, I think, okay, like this is really going to shift the needle now for the next generation. And that makes me very optimistic.
Thank you. So this is going to be the last question before we turn over to the question and answer part of today. And so I wanted to ask the same question for each of you. And I'm going to start off with Nuria. So as a woman leader, as a leader in the organization, but as a role model, what insights, learnings, or advice would you give to Maxwell students, to a student sitting there listening today? What advice would you give?
Well, when I first arrived in Syracuse, I was eager to take the world by storm. But I had no idea how difficult it would be for me to get used to this new life. Actually, the thing that struck me the most was the cold. It may sound funny, but I had never been so cold in my entire life. Lima's lowest temperature during the winter is about 64 degrees. So imagine the situation. But the cold was not the only thing I had to get used to. My other big challenge was the language. I had a very hard time talking to my classmates or being understood during classes. I was very frustrated in my public administration class, for example. Well, I still remember spending about 2 months practically without speaking. That's something I would never have imagined before arriving at Syracuse, given that I'm a very talkative person. As I'm sure that this happens to most international students, distance worsen these difficulties by all means. And being away from my family, my friends, my boyfriend at that time was indeed challenging. And in more than one occasion, I confess that I'm seriously considered dropping out and returning to Peru. I even went so far as I bring my I-20 form to the International Affairs Office asking for permission to leave the country. I am thankful to the staff that gave me confidence and discouraged me to quit. Yeah, but as you realize, my idea of returning to Peru never went through. As time went by, the difficulties became less intense. And little by little, I got used to the cold face situations that forced me to use English better and had the opportunity to meet new people, which helped me overcome the loneliness and that often comes with parting from our loved ones. And pondering my time studying at Maxwell and walking by University Avenue, Marshall Street, or even going to the Cosmo Pizza, I think that the best advice I can give to current students, especially international ones, is to enjoy your time there. Because maybe this is the last time you are going to be a student without any other responsibilities. I'm pretty sure that back your homes, you are going to encounter other type of challenges and duties. Seize this wonderful time of your life. Maxwell helped me mature personal and professional speaking and allowed me to develop skills, build strong networks, and have an academic experience that made a great impact in my life. I want you all to be sure that with preparation, dedication, and effort, it is possible to change the world. And by the way, I have to say this: go Orange!
Thank you. To Jackie, the question I'm going to adapt the questions a little bit because we're running low on time and some questions have come in. So I'm going to ask the same question, but actually aim it to what advice would you give to students that are going into male-dominated or industries like IT, for example? If you're a student sitting there at kind of the challenges of going into an industry you're going to have to break some more China, I guess, to put it that way.
Yeah. I'd say, there's a lot of conversation now in the international development community about being inclusive and including citizens and generational aspects of the population. But I'd say be inclusive in your decision-making. When you're with a very tough decision, make sure that you have the right people at the table to inform your decision-making. Make sure that you have someone who would be affected by your decision, gather information from them, someone that might influence any decision that you might make, the outcome of any decision you might make. Have at the table those who can help to sustain any decision that you want to make. So be inclusive. Don't make decisions on a dime. Make sure you gather as much information from all the various stakeholders as possible before moving forward. Someone gave me a great piece of advice when I became Inspector General at State Department. They said, there's a culture at State Department that someone will likely hang around until the very late hours of the evening when they see that you're leaving the office and try and pitch their decision to you. Listen, but don't act on it. Wait till the next day and gather more information. So be inclusive in your decision-making. I'd also say be resilient, be your own best advocate. You more than anyone else is going to be responsible for you and will advance your interests. When I was coming up through GAO and I thought I was ready to move in senior executive service. So I went to my immediate supervisor, as the protocol would suggest, and said, I want to apply. He says, Jackie, he says, you'll absolutely get in. He said, but you have several colleagues who are male, they're heads of their households. You don't have a family, right now. Just wait a little bit and let them go first, let them get their chance. I went home and I cried and I put in my paperwork the next day because I have to advocate for myself. Girls have to advocate for themselves, particularly when you're in an environment that doesn't look like you, doesn't feel like you, doesn't bring the same kind of values and history that you have brought to the table. So be your own best advocate. And most importantly, as all on this panel have said, find your voice and use it.
Thank you. And Shira, we've one last question, time for one last question. So I'm going to adapt a question that one of the audience members asked, and that is, what advice would you give to someone who's going into the international sector? You know, as a woman who is working, has worked in multiple places, you know, what advice would you give to a student who is interested in following in your footsteps and working both within the US and abroad? Oh, you're on, I'm sorry, you're on mute, Shira.
All right. I would say, and I say this to a lot of young people who I talk with, that, you know, think of your career in international development, you know, not like an escalator where you kind of hop on and then you're going to ride it to the top, or like your destination. Think of it kind of like driving on a highway, right? And a highway, you know, it can be windy sometimes, might be flat, it might have like an uphill section, there are off ramps, there are on ramps, right? And it's not, the highway itself is taking you in a certain direction. So particularly when you're early in your career, you know, you won't know specifically, like, this is where I'm going to be in 20 years. But you need to find that passion, right? Because, you know, once you start working, you know, you will be spending 8 to 10 hours a day. That's a lot of, more than a third of your available hours, right? So you really need to be kind of finding your passion. And then as you go along this highway, you know, you might take an off ramp, and, you know, maybe you'll take a scenic route for a while. Maybe you'll like pull off somewhere and, like, you know, check something out. You might find that that's kind of an aspect of your passion. So like you might pursue, you know, a new road from there, or you might find, which I have found myself, you know, you get somewhere and, you know, that's not really for you. That's okay. You know, you can take the on-ramp, get back on the highway, look for a new destination. So I think just have that mindset and follow your passion.
Thank you so much. And thank you to everyone. This has been a delight to moderate. And so we've unfortunately run out of time, so I'm going to pass it back to Dean Van Slyke.
Thank you so much, Chris and Nuria, Shiro, and Jackie, for an insightful and inspiring conversation today. I was just beaming at listening to each of you. For our audience, you know, these 4 participants, all women of achievement, demonstrate 3 fundamental issues. First, their public service extends throughout their careers in their work in the public, private, and non-governmental sectors. Second, their commitment to governance and improving the public good reflects firsthand experiences and expertise at the intersections of government and the different sectors in different jurisdictions. And third, no matter where they've been and where they'll continue to go, we heard it from them. They offer leadership, engaged and ethical approaches to developing citizens and leaders with a fundamental commitment to making all that they do greater and better as a result of their involvement. We are so proud of all they have and continue to do, and are very grateful for their participation and the authentic, constructive, and forward-looking ideas and actions that they shared today. The Maxwell School is committed and remains so to a rigorous social science education and the development of leaders with a fundamental commitment to strengthening governance and public service. Our commitment to further building a school that is diverse and representative and focused on an inclusive learning environment reflects our desires to meet the world where it is and strive to make significant contributions that improve equity, access, and justice. The women leaders we've heard from today are representative of the school's mission and our strategic goals. Your continued engagement and philanthropic support of the school enables us to strive and achieve this ambitious mission and to leave our communities better than we found them. I want to offer my thanks to Maxwell's outstanding information and computing technology team for supporting this event, to Jessica Murray, our Director of Alumni Engagement, the Maxwell Dean's Office, and again to all our participants. And I want to ask you to please watch your email for additional virtual events this spring that will feature opportunities to engage with Maxwell faculty and your fellow graduates. And if you have ideas for future topics, members of our faculty or fellow graduates that you want to hear from, or other suggestions for future events, please submit them to us at alum, A-L-U-M, at Maxwell, SYR, edu. Thank you again for joining us today. Be well and stay healthy, and go Orange. Thanks everyone for being here.